Welcome everybody, my name is Tim Sandy. I'm a VMware Systems Engineer and I dedicate tech data. Now in this session we're going to be talking about VSAN 6, and this is going to be a demonstration, and I'm actually going to walk through and show you how to enable and do some initial configurations with VSAN 6. Now tech data has a solution center, and we're going to be actually configuring some of the new equipment that we have in the solution center. So the the ready nodes that we have purchased and installed already into the Tech Data Solution Center, they are HPDL 360p G8 servers. These are just one of the many vSAN ready nodes that you can purchase. And these also have the HP 220 pass-through controllers, a SSD, as well as multiple hard drives in each one of these DL360p servers that we've purchased, which are again the vSAN ready nodes. Now all of these, when you purchase a ready node, that means that all of the server, the pass-through controllers, the SSDs, as well as the regular hard drives are all on our vSAN hardware compatibility list. And then we've also already installed vSphere and vCenter 6, and then we're going to be configuring the VSAN 6, which again is, just in case you don't know, VSAN is actually built into and baked into the hypervisor itself, so it is a part of vSphere 6. It's just a matter of enabling it. So that is the equipment that we're using and that we've installed into the Tech Data Solution Center. And this here is a picture of the Tech Data Solution Center and the racks to where we've installed the servers. So just to give you an idea of what it looks like. Now just to go over the quick configuration steps, we're going to again validate that we have a minimum of 3 hosts in a vSAN cluster, because that is the requirements, a minimum of 3. We're going to make sure that each one of these hosts have a vSAN port group created. Then we're going to go ahead and enable vSAN, add or validate that we've already added a vSAN license, create fault domains, add disks, and then add a host to the cluster. So those are going to be kind of the things that we're going to be discussing and going through within the demonstration here. So let's go ahead and get started, and let's start off with looking at the vSphere web client. Okay, now as you see here, I'm already logged into the vSphere 6 web client, which is the primary interface that you as a VMware admin are going to use, with the newer version especially. Pretty much everything is done through the web client now. There still is the local C# client, but the use of that is getting very minimal, and eventually you will see that the vSphere C# client will go away, and there'll only be the web client eventually. So I'm logged in, and as you see, I have a data center, as well as I've already created a cluster, and I called it vSAN cluster. Now in the cluster, I already have 3 ESX hosts, vSAN 1, 2, and 3. And then I also have a vSAN 4, which I will add later on in this demonstration. But for right now, we do have 3 hosts in this vSAN cluster. Right now, vSAN is not enabled. Now, if you recall, in order to have a vSAN cluster and to enable vSAN and use it, you do have to have a minimum of 3 ESX hosts that participate, that have SSDs and regular hard drives in them, or unless with the new vSphere 6 vSAN version, you do have the option to do all flash type or SSD drives, so you can do that as well. But anyway, you do have to have these hosts. Now I am using the HP DL360p G8 servers here, and I do have regular one SSD as well as multiple regular hard drives in it in this particular environment. So first off, again, we have to have the minimum of the 3 nodes in the cluster. Now after that, to get the cluster and the hosts prepared to enable vSAN, you first have to go to each of your hosts, and you have to configure a vSAN port group. Now you can use either a virtual standard switch or a virtual distributed switch, either way. Now in this example here, I do have both a standard switch as well as a distributed switch at the moment, just to show you both. Now right now I'm primarily running on the distributed switch, and as you see, I've created 3 port groups. I have a management port group, a vMotion port group, and also a vSAN port group. Now, these are VM kernel port groups, so these require that you assign an IP address, a subnet, gateway to them, as well as DNS, as you will see. And what you're going to need to do is for every host that's going to participate in a vSAN cluster, you are going to need to create a vSAN port group, assign it an IP address, and then you're also going to be able to enable the vSAN service to it. As you see in this host here, I've already done that. I have the management, the vMotion, and the vSAN port group. If we go over to host number 2, I also have the vSAN port group created. And then on the third host, I also have the vSAN port group created. Now, what I've done is I've left on vSAN 4, I've left that distributed port group not created yet, so I can show you an example of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add that port group, so then we can add that vSAN 04 host into the vSAN cluster later on. So we're going to go ahead up to this icon here, add host networking, VM kernel network adapter. Next, you're going to select an existing network. So again, I'm using the distributed switch, and again, I'm creating, or I need to create a VM kernel port for the vSAN traffic. So I'm going to select that and click OK. Then next. And then you need to make sure that you select virtual SAN traffic here. This enables that virtual SAN service for that traffic and that communication. So you need to make sure you do that. And then click Next. And then we're going to go ahead and assign it an IP address. And select Next. And then Finish. And give it a few seconds. And as you see, the new vSAN port group for that vSAN traffic is now showing up. So now we've done that on that 4th host. Now let's go up to the cluster here. So we have our 3 nodes in a cluster already. We've already established and created those port groups for vSAN traffic. So now when we click on the cluster, the next step, we're going to go ahead and enable vSAN. So click on the cluster. Then we're going to go over to the Manage tab, onto Settings, which it defaults to, and then under the Virtual SAN category, we're going to go to General. As you see here, since we've not enabled vSAN, it is all grayed out for everything for vSAN. So we're going to go and we're going to click the Edit button, but as you see, it says that vSAN is currently turned off. So let's go over, select the Edit button. And enabling vSAN is as simple as checking this box here. Now we have 2 options when we turn on virtual SAN. We can set up to add disks to storage automatically or manually. Now automatically we'll go ahead and look at all available disks on each one of your hosts that are in your vSAN cluster. It automatically grab those disks, both the SSDs and regular hard drives if you have those, put them into a vSAN data store. Or we can do manual so that you can manually select which ones you want to add. So for this example, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show you using the manual method. Click OK. Now it takes a minute for it to enable vSAN. It has to go ahead and configure the cluster as well as the 3 hosts in the cluster. So this will take a minute. And what will happen is this will start to turn as you see here. We have a network status of normal. Now initially it's going to show that we have no hosts in the cluster, no available disks and storage, but again it takes a little bit to go ahead and configure them, so you can occasionally hit the refresh button. And as you see now, we have 3 hosts, we have 3 flash disks, and actually what it's done is I had enabled this before and disabled it, and then I'm re-enabling it now again, so it has picked up some of the configuration from before that I had grabbed a single hard disk as well as each one of the individual SSDs in on each one of those hosts. So we do have a little bit of storage already. Now, normally if I had not done that, what we would do is we would go down to licensing, and you would go ahead and you would add the license and assign the license so that you can actually use VSAN. So that is a requirement. You need to put that VSAN license as a separate license just for VSAN. So you would put that in there. As you see, I already have it in. So now let's go back to the fault domains category here. Now, as you see, it went ahead and we have one fault domain already with all three of my hosts in it. Now, these fault domains, you can create individual or separate fault domains. These are great for if you have several server racks with VSAN nodes across multiple VSAN nodes in each one of them, and you want to ensure that in case you lose an entire rack, that you want to make sure that, because remember, VSAN creates a copy of each of your VMs. That's how you have your redundancy. So if you want to guarantee that if you lose a rack, that both of your copies of that VM is not on that single rack or within that single rack, you can create these fault domains. You can create a fault domain for each one of your rack. So fault domain needs to have multiple vSAN ready nodes in it, or vSAN nodes rather. And so, for example, if I have 3 racks with 3 ready nodes in each one of them, I could create 3 fault domains, and that way you can ensure that as it makes replicas or copies of those VMs on the virtual data store, you can ensure that those are in separate racks. So that's what fault domains are and what they're used for. It's to create that kind of a barrier and also to give you that assurance that those copies of your VMs are not within the same rack, so that if you lost that one entire rack, you don't lose both copies. So that's a fault domain. So let's go ahead and look at disk management. Now, as you see here, as I said, we already had grabbed 3 of the SSDs, or 1 from each one of the hosts, as well as 1 disk from each one. So if you look on vSAN 1 that we're currently on right now, it already created a disk group. And then in that disk group, you have the SSD as well as one of the hard drives. Now the best practice from VMware is it's better to have multiple disk groups with fewer hard drives in each disk group rather than having just one disk group with a bunch of disks in it. Because if you ever have to rebuild it in case you lose one of your hosts, and vSAN has to move a lot of those copies of VMs and that data around, it doesn't have to redo that entire virtual data store. So just to show you real quick here, what we can do, I'm going to click on this particular data group, or actually let's just go ahead and go up here and we're going to claim disks. So what we're going to do is, because I have multiple hard drives still left in each one of the servers, I'm going to go ahead and select all eligible disks. Now if you had any disks that were not eligible, you could do the drop down here and go all hosts and look at any available hosts and disks that are not potentially eligible. So again, these would maybe part of the problem as to why disk may not be eligible is with vSAN ready nodes, you have to use traditionally pass-through controllers so that they have direct access to each one of the disks. So if I got 5 standard hard disks in there, you're going to see 5 separate logical disks showing up. Basically one logical RAID for each one of those physical disks. So if by chance you've already used, or you've already have some sort of a partition of any type, whether it be a Windows or VMDK or anything like that, that's already been established on one of those disks, vSAN cannot bring that into the fold. So you need to make sure that these disks have not been formatted in any way or anything. And that would be why that they might show up as ineligible disks. So again, we went ahead and we selected all of these available disks that are ready. We're going to go ahead and click OK. Now this will take a little bit to go ahead and add all the disks in. You can go down to your recent tasks and watch as it adds the disks. being that I did select a bunch of disks and it has to add to the virtual SAN data store, it will take a little bit of a while to do this. So one by one, it'll add the disks from each host. If we go back up to General and we start refreshing the page, as you notice, we were at about 2.7 terabytes before, and now we're at 11.71 terabytes. So as you can see, we already had added all 3 of the SSDs, and we added 3 of the possible 14 eligible disks previously, and now we've added 10 more for a total of 13 disks. So now it's completed, and as you see, we now have all 14 of the disks, which gives us a total of 12.61 terabytes when we originally started off. So now I've showed you how to add disks, so let's go ahead and add this additional host to the VSAN cluster. So now that we've added this 4th host into the VSAN cluster, we should be able to add the disks. However, I did want to show something to you though, rather than going ahead and adding it, since I've already shown you how to add disks to the cluster. Adding the host is basically just dragging it into the VSAN cluster. It'll then pick up that host and any associated disks. But I wanted to show you something here. So if we look at the VSAN cluster, and again we're in disk management here, you'll notice I'm not seeing anything under the VSAN 4. If we go up to the disk group and select claim disks, you'll see that we don't see VSAN 04 showing up with all of its hard drives, so that we can select them and add them to the VSAN cluster. If you go over, as I said before, go to all hosts, as you can see, I can't select VSAN 4. The reason why is here are my standard hard drives, but my SSD is not showing up. What I've done is I've pulled the SSD drive out so that it won't show up, because I wanted to show you that without that SSD drive, no matter if your regular hard drives are showing up, in order to have and bring in that host into the VSAN cluster and to be able to use those regular hard drives for your data storage, you have to have that SSD for caching on that host. So this was just a way to show you about if your SSD is not showing up, you're not going to be able to add any of your storage from that host into the VSAN cluster, and then that shows you how, by selecting all hosts here, it'll show up some of those ineligible ones that I was referring to either. So now if we go over to our storage under our VSAN cluster, as you now see, now that we have a VSAN data store. Now this VSAN data store is spelled this way, and this is the data store that's created by VSAN all the time. So as you go over to here, you have the summary, gives you some basic information for the volume. You have manage, gives you some basic properties, your capacity, storage I/O control, hardware acceleration, and also your default storage policy. Now, this is created automatically, hence the name default storage policy. Now you can go in here and edit it if you choose and create other ones. Now this is not where you do it, but I can show you that in just a second. But then if we go up and we look at monitor, you can see we have an area here for all issues as well as triggered alarms. So this is where you want to go to do some troubleshooting, watch different types of information. Here we have the performance. Now because we just enabled it, the performance charts have not built yet, so that takes a little bit of time. We have tasks that may be running. So if you're rebuilding or adding or removing drives, that show up here, as well as events. And all these events is as we made configuration changes, these are all showing up in here. So your monitor tab and your manage tab is going to be your more useful ones for your VSAN storage. And then of course your related objects. You're going to have any VMs that are in the VSAN data store, which we currently don't have any on there right now, any templates, as well as the associated hosts in that create that VSAN data store. So now if we go up here, go to the home page, we go to the VM storage policy, you'll see that we have two storage policies here. One is for virtual SAN, that default storage policy, as well as the vVol no requirements policy. These are the default ones that are created out of the box. Now, if we wanted to change our vSAN storage policy, we could come up here to the pencil and we could edit this policy. As you see here, we have number of failures to tolerate with 3 hosts. The most that you can do is 1. If you want to do 2, you have to have at least 4 hosts. Number of stripes per object, and if you click on any one of these little information icons here, you'll see here it gives you the definition of what all of these settings are and what they will do as you can adjust them. So depending on what kind of redundancy you want, you can go ahead and make these selections in here. So just go through and check these out. And then also you have a selection here for storage compatibility. And that's the default policy. Now again, we can do different things. We can create a new policy. We can check compliance against policy. We can also clone a policy. So if you want to take this default policy, you could clone it, give it a new name, and then set it up depending on what your requirements are. So this is your storage policies and where they're at and where you make the modifications for them. So that is basically the process in which how you're going to initially configure a VSAN. Now again, I used vSphere 6 along with VSAN 6. The steps that we went through is we're going to add the nodes to the clusters. You must have a minimum of 3. You then are going to make sure that you have a VSAN port group for VSAN traffic, and make sure you check that box for the service. You're going to enable VSAN. You're going to license it. You're going to make sure that you have a fault domain, or you're going to, if you want multiple fault domains, you're going to set them up and put the appropriate hosts in those fault domains. And then finally, you're going to go in and claim the disk. That is, if you set it up for manual, such as we did, or if you did it automatically when you first enabled VSAN, again, it would have gone and grabbed all those disks from those hosts that were available in the cluster. So that is pretty much how you enable and configure initially VSAN 6 using, again, vSphere 6, and we did this all from the vSphere 6 web client. So hopefully this gives you a good idea of how quick and relatively easy it is to get VSAN up and running. Obviously, you have to have your network configurations on your host. You have to have vSphere loaded, vCenter deployed. So there are some prerequisites, but the actual getting VSAN enabled and getting it up and running and configured, that is all there is to it. So it's pretty simple. There's not a lot to it. So I hope this was informative for you, and I hope to see you back on my other demonstrations.